During a Congressional Oversight hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell questioned FBI Director Kash Patel about how the FBI handled and reviewed investigative material related to Jeffrey Epstein, a case that continues to attract public attention because of the seriousness of the crimes and unresolved questions about transparency. Swalwell focused on the process used by the FBI, asking how decisions are made about reviewing files, sharing information, and applying the same standards to all individuals, regardless of political or public status, including whether former President Donald Trump was mentioned in the records. Patel did not confirm or deny the presence of any specific names, explaining that legal restrictions, privacy protections, and court orders prevent the FBI from discussing individual identities in public hearings. He stated that investigative files often contain many names for contextual reasons, such as interviews, background references, or peripheral information, and that a name appearing in a file does not indicate wrongdoing. Patel emphasized that the FBI must balance transparency with its legal duty to protect due process and investigative integrity. While lawmakers expressed concern that limited disclosure has contributed to public mistrust, the exchange highlighted a broad tension between congressional demands for openness and law enforcement obligations to follow the law, showing how high-profile cases like Epstein continue to shape debates over accountability, transparency, and public trust in federal institutions. During the hearing, FBI Director Kash Patel initially responded to routine questions on intelligence, funding, counterterrorism efforts, and surveillance procedures, using standard prepared answers reflecting his experience in similar congressional sessions, and the discussion followed a familiar oversight format until Representative Eric Swalwell shifted the focus to the handling of files related to Jeffrey Epstein. At that point, Swalwell made clear he was not seeking a repetition of earlier testimony, but clarification on information he believed had not been fully addressed previously, directing his questions toward what the FBI had reviewed and disclosed about the Epstein materials. This change in subject marked a noticeable transition in the hearing, from routine procedural discussion to a more focused examination of transparency and disclosure, as Swalwell emphasized congressional oversight responsibilities, and Patel maintained that his responses were constrained by legal limits governing sensitive investigative records. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell pressed FBI Director Kash Patel about the handling and classification of files related to Jeffrey Epstein, specifically asking why documents referencing former President Donald Trump had been reclassified since Patel assumed his position. Patel responded that he had no knowledge of any reclassification targeting materials related to a specific individual, and emphasized that he could not comment on internal document handling or personnel decisions. Swalwell then presented an internal FBI memorandum dated March 15, issued 3 months after Patel became director, which instructed the Classification Review Board to prioritize evaluation of Epstein-related materials referencing current government officials or individuals connected to them. The memorandum included the signature of the deputy director and was shown publicly during the hearing to illustrate congressional concern over transparency, accountability, and whether all investigative materials were being properly reviewed and classified in accordance with legal and procedural requirements. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell continued pressing FBI Director Kash Patel on whether he was aware of internal classification actions involving Jeffrey Epstein-related records. Patel stated that classification reviews occur routinely and denied having specific knowledge of targeted reclassification tied to any individual. Swalwell challenged that explanation by stating that since Patel assumed office, 23 documents previously cleared for public release had been withdrawn and reclassified, and that according to his review, each of those documents referenced former President Donald Trump. He argued that the consistency of those actions raised questions about whether the process reflected a broader pattern rather than coincidence. Patel responded by characterizing the line of questioning as politically motivated and emphasized that classification decisions are governed by established procedures rather than partisan considerations. The exchange marked a sharp escalation in the hearing, shifting it from procedural oversight to a direct dispute over transparency decision-making and whether classification authority was being applied impartially under the law. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell accused FBI Director Kash Patel of improperly using classification authority to withhold information from the public relating to files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, arguing that decisions made under Patel's leadership had the effect of shielding a former president and undermining public trust. Swalwell asserted that Patel as director had a duty to uphold the law and questioned whether reclassification actions amounted to suppressing material evidence. Patel rejected the characterization and stated he would not speculate on or discuss classified information during The exchange Swalwell referenced what he described as an unclassified summary of witness testimony from 2019 involving a former employee at Epstein's Palm Beach residence, and said the summary listed multiple individuals allegedly seen at the property, stressing that such references did not constitute findings of guilt but raised questions about why related materials were not publicly accessible. He claimed the document included the name of former President Donald Trump and argued that the public deserve clarity about what the files contain. Patel maintained that classification decisions are governed by law and procedure and reiterated that the FBI cannot release or discuss sensitive material without proper authorization. The moment prompted visible reaction in the hearing room and underscored the sharp divide between lawmakers demanding greater transparency and law enforcement officials emphasizing legal limits on disclosure and due process. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell continued his questioning of FBI Director Kash Patel by arguing that testimony and related materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein had been reviewed by the FBI years earlier but were later classified rather than pursued further. Swalwell stated that the Bureau had possessed certain witness testimony for approximately 6 years and questioned why it had not led to additional investigative steps, asserting instead that the material had been sealed from public view. Patel attempted to respond by reiterating that classification and review decisions are made under established legal standards and are not intended to suppress evidence or protect specific individuals. Swalwell countered that the reclassification did not serve national security interests and claimed it had the effect of shielding former President Donald Trump. He then referenced a photograph that has been publicly available for decades showing Trump and Epstein together at Mar-a-Lago in 1997, noting that the image itself has long been in the public domain and was not disputed. The exchange intensified debate in the room and highlighted the central disagreement between lawmakers pressing for greater transparency and law enforcement officials maintaining that investigative decisions, including classification, must follow legal and procedural requirements rather than political pressure. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell continued pressing FBI Director Kash Patel about the FBI's handling of visual evidence connected to Jeffrey Epstein, stating that while one photograph of Epstein with former President Donald Trump from a 1997 event at Mar-a-Lago has been publicly available for years, the FBI possesses additional photographs from the same event that remain classified and stored as evidence. Swalwell argued that the public has not been given access to these images and questioned the justification for keeping them sealed, asking directly what those photographs contain and why they have not been released. Patel responded that the release of evidentiary photographs is governed by multiple considerations, including privacy protections, evidentiary rules, and internal review processes. Swalwell rejected the explanation, asserting that the Epstein investigation itself is no longer active, noting that Epstein is deceased and Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted and sentenced, and argued that continued classification could not be justified on investigative grounds. He claimed that the decision to keep the photographs from public view reflected an effort to protect a powerful individual rather than national security, a charge Patel did not concede, and to which he reiterated that classification decisions are made according to legal and procedural standards rather than political influence. The exchange further intensified the dispute between congressional demands for transparency and the FBI's position that evidence handling and disclosure are constrained by law even in cases of significant public interest. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell pressed FBI Director Kash Patel over the handling and classification of evidence related to Jeffrey Epstein, emphasizing that certain photographs and documents remain sealed despite being of significant public interest. Swalwell challenged Patel on whether classification decisions were influenced by considerations beyond national security or law enforcement, asserting that continued withholding of material appeared to protect powerful individuals. Patel responded that he categorically rejects any suggestion that the FBI acted to shield anyone based on political affiliation and emphasized that all classification and disclosure decisions are governed strictly by legal requirements, investigative procedures, and considerations of national security. Swalwell continued to question the Bureau's transparency practices, highlighting that public confidence depends on clarity and accountability, and that withholding previously collected evidence raises questions about impartiality and procedural consistency. The exchange illustrated the tension between congressional oversight responsibilities and law enforcement constraints, with lawmakers demanding more detailed explanations while the FBI maintained that sensitive material cannot be released outside of established legal and procedural frameworks, even when public interest is high. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell sharply criticized FBI Director Kash Patel, arguing that Patel's professional background and appointment raise questions about impartiality and alleging that evidence linking former President Donald Trump to materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein had been concealed through classification decisions. Swalwell characterized this as a failure of law enforcement and stated that the committee would pursue all lawful oversight tools, including subpoenas, to obtain relevant records. Patel rejected the allegations and maintained that all classification and evidence handling decisions were made according to legal standards, national security considerations, and established FBI procedures. Following the exchange, the hearing continued with unrelated topics, but the confrontation underscored deep disagreements over transparency, oversight, and the limits of disclosure, with observers noting that Swalwell's statements constituted allegations placed on the public record rather than findings of fact, and that any determination regarding wrongdoing would depend on further investigation, legal review, and corroborated evidence rather than testimony alone. Following the exchange, aides and staff members appeared focused on managing the fallout from questions that had not previously been addressed in a public forum, highlighting why the moment drew such attention. For years, materials related to Jeffrey Epstein have been the subject of speculation, rumors, and unverified claims about who may be referenced in investigative records and whether influential individuals received special treatment. However, speculation alone does not constitute proof. In this hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell placed into the public record documents and references he described as internal memoranda and witness summaries, and argued that these materials warranted further scrutiny, particularly where they referenced former President Donald Trump. Swalwell emphasized that raising these issues did not amount to a declaration of guilt, but rather reflected concerns about transparency and whether classification decisions were used appropriately. His statements amounted to allegations made under Congressional Oversight Authority, not factual determinations, and any conclusions about wrongdoing would require independent investigation, corroboration, and legal review. The significance of the moment lay in the fact that concerns long discussed privately or online were articulated openly in an official hearing, underscoring broader questions about oversight, accountability, and public trust in how sensitive investigations involving powerful figures are handled, rather than establishing proof of criminal conduct by any individual. Following the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell stated that the committee would seek further oversight actions, including moving to subpoena the 23 documents he said were reclassified, requesting a closed-door briefing with the FBI's Classification Review Board, and calling for review by the Department of Justice Inspector General into how FBI Director Kash Patel handled evidence related to Jeffrey Epstein. These proposed steps would follow standard congressional oversight procedures, but had not yet been formally approved or initiated at the time of the hearing. It remains uncertain whether the subpoenas or investigations will proceed as announced, since such actions require committee support and often face legal and procedural challenges. Patel has denied any wrongdoing and has maintained that all classification decisions were made according to law, national security considerations, and established FBI protocols. The dispute has nonetheless placed renewed focus on whether documents referencing former President Donald Trump were handled appropriately and whether reclassification decisions were coincidental or part of a broader pattern. Any determination regarding misconduct would depend on future oversight actions, independent review, and legally verified evidence rather than statements made during a single hearing. During the hearing, Representative Eric Swalwell made a formal allegation on the Congressional record asserting that FBI Director Kash Patel had used classification authority in a manner that he claimed protected former President Donald Trump in relation to materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Swalwell stated that his remarks were not political argument but an accusation made under Congressional Oversight Authority, and emphasized that such statements, once entered into the public record, warrant follow-up scrutiny and formal responses. He argued that the questioning represented an effort to force transparency regarding why certain Epstein-related documents were reclassified and whether those actions reflected impartial application of the law. Patel did not accept the allegation and reiterated that all decisions were made according to legal and procedural standards. The significance of the moment lay in the fact that concerns long discussed informally were stated openly in a public hearing, placing them within the scope of congressional review rather than speculation. While no findings of wrongdoing were established, the exchange increased pressure for oversight actions and potential investigation, underscoring how allegations raised in Congress can prompt further inquiry without constituting proof of guilt and leaving final determinations to formal legal and investigative processes. In the aftermath of the hearing, attention shifted to what further oversight steps may follow as lawmakers signaled that scrutiny of the FBI's handling of materials related to Jeffrey Epstein would continue beyond a single session. Earlier questioning by Representative Jim Jordan had already focused on the status and location of Epstein-related files and was cited by observers as part of a broader timeline of congressional inquiry into how those records have been managed, taken together. Together, the exchanges involving Jordan and Representative Eric Swalwell reflect an escalating oversight effort aimed at clarifying classification decisions, document handling, and internal review processes under FBI Director Kash Patel. While no formal findings or enforcement actions resulted from the hearing itself, the questioning placed unresolved issues on the public record and indicated that future hearings, requests for documents, or Inspector General reviews could follow depending on committee decisions and legal procedures, reinforcing that the matter will be addressed through incremental oversight rather than a single definitive event.